Hello everybody, welcome back. This is video number 4 in the series of videos that we are doing to test and explore the middleware for DevOps management, which is DOMGMT. And before we begin, like always, I will set the expectations for this video. In this video, we are going to make some more changes to our database. By that I mean we are going to commit a few more records to our database for our middleware to work as expected. And once done, we should be able to test our middleware for production scenarios or for implementation. Right, so let's get started. I will first of all go to my editor. I'm using VS Code. You can use the editor of your choice. And in this project, within the API directory, if you go to the response folder, you'll find a file called counters.js. Now, within this file, that is counters.js, you will find a few routes, just like here, that says add counter NPR. NPR stands for new project request, and similarly we have add counter EPC for epics, SPR for sprints, and add counter user. Add counter user is the most important one for following along in the next video, because in the next video we are going to do everything that has to do with user management, which is creating user, deleting users, resetting user passwords, etc. And now if you're wondering what is add counter and what does this does, we'll get to that now. So if I go to the GitHub repo, which is github.com /shift2 /domgmt, and I scroll down to the readme file. Right after the instructions for setting up the project on your local machine, you'll find this note that says make the following API calls once and only once for the web services to execute as expected. And the note below says, since MongoDB does not provide incremental sequence numbers as opposed to SQL DBs, the below queries create separate docs to keep track and update sequence numbers for NPR, BFR, EPC, SPR users, and FFR. Now, don't bother about FFR. This is something that I have in my head, which I will add as an additional feature maybe later. But for now, NPR stands for new project request. Like I said, BFR for bug fix request, EPC for epics, SPR for sprints, and of course, users is users. Um, Now, if you read this again, I've mentioned that MongoDB does not provide incremental sequence numbers as opposed to SQL DBs. So, what are these incremental sequence numbers, and how does it help? So, if I open a new tab and I type auto increment field in SQL, the first link I get is W3 schools, so I would open that. And if I scroll down, it says auto increment allows a unique number to be generated automatically when a new record is inserted into a table. So this allows you to create a unique number for every record inserted in a SQL table. Now, SQL type of databases work with tables. So every time you insert a record in a table, it creates a unique number for that table. Usually, these numbers are sequential. In fact, most of the times these numbers are sequential, and it will by default start with 1. So if you see here in this example on the page where they say create table persons, person ID int stands for integer, not null, which means it can never be null, and then it says auto increment. Now this keyword auto increment would create a sequence of numbers every time a record is inserted into the person's table. That is what they've described here. MySQL uses the auto increment keyword to perform an auto increment feature by default the starting value of auto increment is 1, and this is the exact same thing we are going to achieve, uh, but we have to do it ourselves because this is not native to NoSQL databases like MongoDB that we are using. So we will create a separate record. Now I will not call it a table because NoSQLs don't work with tables. We'll call it a record. I will create a separate record or a doc, I could say it, that will keep track of the sequence number and increment the sequence number every time we insert a record into our database, or every time we insert any kind of record. It could be a person, it could be a new project request, it could be an epic sprint, etc. So as we were looking here in the counters file, now this counter within this file, that is counters.js, we have defined the method that creates the doc, uh, which keeps a track of the sequence number. And if you would want to see the schema, the model schema of this counter, you can go to folder called model within the project directory, and within model you will see a file called countersmodel.js. Here we have defined the schema for counters, where it has an ID which is generated by Mongoose. Now again, this object ID is a unique string and it is auto generated by Mongoose, but we do not use this in the project. We do use this in the project, sorry, but we do not use this as an ID for the record that we create and which is presented to the user, because this is a very long string, and this usually is not in sequence. Not usually, but this is definitely not in sequence, and hence it is very hard for a layman to remember or associate his records with. Instead, we use a simpler form where we create sequence numbers using the counters right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, so that it is easier for the end user to recognize or remember these numbers instead of trying to remember a 14 character long string. So it has an ID. The model type, the type is string. Unique is of course true. Required true. Dropped ups. Again, we don't want this field, which is called model type, to get duplicated. Why don't we want that? We'll get to that in a minute, or you'll understand now when we do it. Sequence number, again, it has to be type number. This is the field called sequence underscore value, which is incremented every time we insert a record into our database. All right, so let's quickly get back to our REST client application. I'm using Postman. Now, like I said, I also have a plugin that I can use. So the plugin name is REST client. I think I showed it in the last video. So if I type that, this is the plugin that I'm using, which allows me to make HTTP calls from within the editor. All right, so but in this video I will use Postman. In fact, maybe from all the videos now on I will use Postman, and I will just update the HTTP file and push it back to the GitHub repository for your reference. So if I open Postman, I have my route ready to get my access token. Now remember, in the last video we had created the first user to generate our access token. Now counters are also protected by authentication tokens. How is it done is something we'll discuss in some other video, but for now just remember that we will require an authentication token to create these counters. So I'll create a new token where I have the URI in place with a post request and the request body. where I provide a user ID with user ID, password with the password that I created. I click on send, and that should create a new token. There it goes. Now I will copy this token and I will start creating counters. So to create the counters, the URI is localhost port 5000 forward slash API forward slash v1 forward slash counters forward slash add counter. And to add a counter, the type of counter, I'll put forward slash. Now if I want to create a counter for new project request, which is NPR, NPR is an abbreviation for new project request, I'll just enter NPR with the URI and I'll make it a post request. I'll go to my headers, I create an authorization header, and I'll paste the token that I just generated. I'll click on send, and that should create a counter right here. So you see the sequence value, which is number 1. This is the field that will get auto incremented every time, and it will get concatenated with this string called npr. The field name is model type. And if you remember, just moments ago, we were discussing why don't we use the underscore ID, because this is always going to be unique for each record. But like you can see here, this is not something that the user would want to remember or will be able to remember. Instead, if I have got my new project request IDs as NPR1, NPR2, NPR3, it would be much easier for me or anyone else to remember. So the model type, which is a string NPR, gets concatenated with the sequence value, which for now is 1. And this gets, or this creates a unique ID for the new project request that we create. So every time we insert a new project request, or every time we insert a record called new a new project, sorry, and every time we insert a new project type record in our database, we give it an ID of NPR followed by a sequence number. So whenever you create a new project request, you'll see the SRID field, which is the service request ID field, as NPR1, NPR2, NPR3, and so on. All right, after NPR, let us also create the counter for Epic. So we'll call it EPC. I'll click on send, and that would create a counter for Epic. Similarly, I will create a counter for sprints, SPR, and we get a counter for sprints. I'll also create a counter for bug fix request, which is BFR. That's done. And the most important one for the next video, user. So USER, user, and that creates a counter for user. So like I explained, for new project request, whenever we create a user, the user will get a user ID, which will be concatenated result of this model type field, which is USR, followed by the sequence value, which is 1. And this will obviously keep incrementing every time. So it would be USR1. When you create another user, it would be USR2. When you create yet another user, it would be USR3, and so on. And with that, we complete the setup of our database, and we have made all necessary commits to our database that we would require to test our middleware further. And from now on, it is going to be a smooth sail. Now, by what do I mean by a smooth sail? You don't have to make any more changes, or you don't have to do anything else to set up your database, your middleware, or anything else for that matter. We would just straight away get into testing the REST API for DevOps management. With that, we can complete this video. Thank you for watching.